On March 7, 2024, Sweden joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, becoming its 32nd member. For generations, Sweden stayed militarily non-aligned. Critics say this sudden shift was a mistake. This film lays out 5 reasons why. First, NATO membership places Sweden closer to a live front line in the Baltic Sea. Second, it locks the country into steep, long-term defense bills. Third, it hands parts of Sweden's security policy to a US-led framework through basing and legal deals. Fourth, it bends domestic law and diplomacy to alliance politics. Fifth, it unsettles Sweden's identity, splitting public opinion and shrinking space for dissent. We define terms as we go. NATO is a military alliance. Article 5 is the rule that an attack on one ally is treated as an attack on all. Now the costs, plainly told, from a critical lens. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, Sweden stayed out of military alliances. This stance is called non-alignment. It means not joining a bloc like NATO. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Sweden changed course. On May 18, 2022, Sweden applied to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is a military alliance. Its core rule is Article 5. Article 5 says an attack on one ally is treated as an attack on all. 2 members, Turkey and Hungary, held up Sweden's bid. Turkey pressed for tougher action on terrorism. Hungary slowed the vote in its parliament. Hungary's legislature finally approved the accession in late February 2024. Its president signed the ratification on March 5, 2024. With all approvals done, Sweden deposited its papers in Washington on March 7, 2024. That made Sweden NATO's 32nd member that day. Joining NATO also came with deeper U.S. military cooperation. Sweden and the United States signed a defense cooperation agreement called the DCA in December 2023. Parliament approved it in June 2024. It took effect on August 15, 2024. The agreement allows U.S. forces access to 17 named Swedish sites and lets the United States pre-position equipment. Supporters call this practical. Critics say it is a large step away from Swedish control over security policy. This video looks at the negative side of these changes. It focuses on exposure to conflict in the Baltic Sea, rising costs, sovereignty trade-offs under the DCA, legal shifts tied to accession diplomacy, and the hit to Sweden's identity. NATO membership put Sweden right on a tense front. Moscow warned of political and military technical countermeasures as Sweden entered the alliance in 2024. That means more military activity around Sweden and a higher risk of incidents. The Baltic Sea has already seen repeated hybrid threats, actions below open war, like sabotage of pipelines and data cables. In October 2023, the Baltic Connector gas pipeline between Finland and Estonia was damaged, with investigators focusing on a ship's dragged anchor through 2024-2025. More cable damage prompted tighter patrols. NATO created new structures to guard undersea infrastructure and, in 2025, launched a dedicated Baltic mission. Sweden is now committing assets to these patrols, warships and an airborne surveillance plane, marking a clear shift from quiet non-alignment to daily frontline tasks. Strategically, the island of Gotland becomes a prime target in any crisis. Critics argue that all of this raises the chance that Sweden is pulled into confrontation first, not last. Before we continue with the video and my further explanation about Finland, I want to ask for your help. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subs by the end of the year, so I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe and help me out. Okay, let's continue. Money is the clearest cost. Sweden already reports defense outlays of 2.2% of GDP for 2024 using NATO's broader definition. That is above the older 2% yardstick and raises the baseline for future budgets. Percent of GDP means the share of the whole economy spent on the military in a year. In June 2025, Parliament approved 300 billion Swedish kroner in borrowing to speed rearmament. About 250 billion is earmarked for the armed forces and 50 billion for civil defense and infrastructure. Ministers said no tax hikes are planned, implying shifts from other programs. The plan points to a path toward roughly 3.5% of GDP on defense by 2032, a commitment. The 2026 budget moves the target quickly. The government announced an 18% year-on-year increase, taking defense to 2.8% of GDP in 2026 and projecting around 3.1% by 2028. Money covers air defense systems, rocket artillery, naval ships, and transport aircraft. It also expands stocks of munitions and parts, which must be maintained and replaced each year. Sweden's central bank governor has warned it is very important to return to fiscal discipline after these extraordinary measures. Some defense and Ukraine spending has been kept outside the ordinary budget rules for now. That choice may help accelerate rearmament today, but critics say it heightens the risk of crowding out later, when bigger military bills squeeze room for welfare, schools, transport, or aid. The U.S.-Sweden Defense Cooperation Agreement, or DCA, shifts practical control over parts of Sweden's security policy. It entered into force on August 15, 2024. The agreement grants U.S. forces access to 17 named Swedish sites and allows pre-positioning, meaning U.S. weapons and equipment can be stored in Sweden for rapid use. Critics say this blurs who decides what happens, when, and on whose terms. The text also permits areas on these bases to be set aside for exclusive U.S. use. In such zones, Washington controls entry. Day-to-day legal questions are shaped by NATO's Status of Forces Agreement, plus DCA provisions on jurisdiction over U.S. personnel and contractors. Opponents argue this narrows Sweden's court's reach and complicates accountability. Another flashpoint is nuclear ambiguity. Government policy says no nuclear weapons in peacetime, but the DCA itself does not include an explicit nuclear ban clause. The Prime Minister has also said Sweden could host nuclear weapons in wartime, which critics view as a major break with past policy. Accession diplomacy changed Swedish law and practice in ways critics dislike. In June 2023, Sweden passed a new anti-terror law that criminalizes participation in terrorist organizations. Supporters say it aligns with EU rules. Legal scholars warn it risks chilling freedom of association and was pushed to answer Turkish demands during NATO talks. Participation is broad and can sweep in support activities that stop short of violence. Policy shifted elsewhere, too. In September 2022, Stockholm lifted its arms export embargo to Turkey, reversing an earlier stance. Courts held their line. Sweden's Supreme Court blocked several extraditions that Ankara sought, but opponents say the broader trend is clear. Alliance. Politics now shape Swedish law, exports, and diplomacy. Extradition means handing a suspect to another state for trial or punishment. Even with court pushback, critics see lasting pressure on rights and on Sweden's independent foreign policy. For centuries, Sweden's identity leaned on neutrality and a strong peace tradition. NATO entry jolted that self-image. Peace organizations say debate narrowed, calling the shift reckless and warning that disarmament voices are now sidelined. The move also changed everyday symbols, joint drills, new flags on bases, and a harder public tone about war and preparedness. Opinion has been fluid. Support surged in 2022 after Russia's full-scale invasion, but by late 2024, a national survey showed the country split, roughly 4 in 10 in favor, a similar share against, and a large undecided group. For critics, that ambivalence signals an unresolved identity crisis. Sweden traded a distinctive role for a bloc identity, and the public hasn't fully bought in. Gotland as a stage. In June 2024, Baltops 24 brought large Allied amphibious and naval drills across the Baltic, Sweden's first Baltops as a NATO member, putting Gotland's role in sharper focus. Whole Nordic maneuvers. In March 2024, Nordic Response expanded cross-border air, sea, and land operations across Norway, Sweden, and Finland, normalizing a higher operational tempo on Swedish soil and in nearby waters. Undersea scares become routine. Since late 2023, damage to the Baltic Connector pipeline and multiple data power cables has driven permanent patrols and new NATO structures to guard seabed infrastructure. In January 2025, NATO launched Baltic Sentry, and Sweden pledged up to 3 warships plus an ASC-890 surveillance aircraft. Concrete, ongoing commitments that bind Sweden to frontline tasks. Watch the money first. How Stockholm deploys the SEK 300 billion in borrowing, what actually gets delivered, and whether extra budget defense and Ukraine costs are folded back into normal rules will show the real trade-offs. Rising targets toward a chunk of 3% plus of GDP mean sustainment bills that can squeeze welfare, schools, and infrastructure. Track the DCA's rollout. Which of the 17 sites get upgrades, how much space becomes exclusive use for U.S. forces, and how jurisdiction disputes are handled in practice will indicate how much day-to-day control Sweden keeps. Transparency and parliamentary oversight will be key tests. Watch the Baltic. Undersea incidents and the tempo of NATO's new Baltic Sentry patrols could normalize higher risk and miscalculation. Finally, keep an eye on nuclear ambiguity and public opinion. Any legal clarification on nuclear policy, plus polling swings, will reveal whether the identity shock deepens or stabilizes. Sweden's NATO decision, critics argue, traded a century of low-profile safety for high-visibility risk. It brought a frontline role in the Baltic, a staircase of military budgets, deeper U.S. basing and legal footprints, tighter laws shaped by accession bargaining, and a shaken national identity. These costs are not one-off. They recur year after year. The question critics pose is simple. Did Sweden buy deterrence by mortgaging autonomy and calm?